Hi everybody, welcome to week 14. This week we're going to extend jQuery's functionality a little bit and focus on jQuery plugins. We'll also use a library called jQuery UI, or jQuery User Interface, to add functionality to our jQuery. We'll also hand out the final project requirements. Let's get started. Okay, so what is a plugin? Well, in the jQuery sense, it's going to extend its functionality. It's pre-written jQuery code that will add features for almost any task that you see that jQuery can cover. Now, some of these plugins are accepted by the jQuery organization, and some are written by outside sources. But usually the ones that are written by outside sources have enough feedback so that they maintain some semblance of code quality. Generally, if a plugin is a bad plugin or doesn't work properly, it'll find its way out of the jQuery community. So we're going to look at some plugins today, and we're going to look at some websites that offer plugins that have really strong reputations, and we'll give you some tips on what to look for when finding a plugin. So what type of work do these plugins do? Well, some of them will display images as far as lining up gallery items, things like that. We see a lot of them do the heavy lifting for us with slideshows, carousels. We also see jQuery plugins used for menus and navigation. I use them personally for tooltips. Whenever I build an educational site, I like to have a tooltip that explains any word that is a certain amount of syllables or any word that's confusing. I also will use a jQuery plugin for validation. It's called Ketchup. There are other jQuery plugins for forms and validation, but there's a big reason why we went over this in the course, so that you know how to get basic validation with jQuery. But now that you're at this point in the course, you should be ready for plugins that do a lot of the things that we worked so hard to learn earlier in the course. Okay, so where do we go? Well, my favorite site is plugins.jquery.com. That's the jQuery plugin registry. When you go to the home page there, and I'll make separate videos for this after, and I'll put it inside this folder for this week. But after you go to that site, you're going to just enter a search for what you're looking for, and the search is pretty loose. You can mention offshoots of something like a slideshow, and it'll find you everything that looks like a slideshow. It might even be a carousel. So the registry is a huge thing. There's also another site called jQueryplugins.net. Also, one of my favorites is GitHub. Just github.com. If you look for jQuery plugin, you'll find most of these plugins already on GitHub. Also, Google Code and SourceForge. I'd say these are the 5 biggest. But what I would say to you is when you find a jQuery plugin, look for ones that have a demo, a sample code, and a tutorial. Those are the most likely to be very consistent. Rarely do I find one that doesn't work. I will say that. But it depends on what you need for the job. And if you have a good idea of what you need or what you're looking for, it's a lot easier to implement what jQuery will give you. The most popular of the plugins, if you've ever seen a modal or lightbox window, those are super popular. Here we see Lightbox, Fancybox, Thickbox, and Colorbox. Of these 4, I use Fancybox the most. Fancybox actually allows us to put HTML and CSS inside the modal window. So I've used Fancybox for things like registration forms, so that the modal window will pop up, and you'll see that modal window, and you'll be able to focus on the text fields. There's also box sliders, jQuery Cycle 2, which is written by Malsip, and jCarousel. So most of the plugins are modal windows and sliders and carousels. Those are probably the 3 biggest things you use these jQuery plugins for. So how do we add them? Well, usually you download the plugin code. It usually comes in the zip format. And then you unzip the file and you put it in a folder, and you just simply reference it in your code. And usually you include the jQuery core library above where you call the plugin. So in the fourth point here, the plugin script tag must appear after the jQuery library script tag. That's because the plugins depend on variables that get defined in the jQuery library. So once you see the demos or the code tutorials on this, you'll see that the plugin script source tag will always be after jQuery, and it'll start to make sense. If you ever make a mistake where the plugin goes above the jQuery library script tag, you'll notice that there will be a lot of errors in your console, and the reason is because the methods defined in the plugin are not defined yet by the jQuery library, which must be before the plugin tag. Now, many of these plugins contain multiple JavaScript files, so you have to absolutely make sure that the JS file is in the same folder as the HTML file, or that the path is correct if you're using a folder structure. Professionally, I see a JS folder on the root level of all servers, and that's usually where they'll go. So again, plugins commonly come with demo code. It'll be your responsibility to recognize where that demo code, how that demo code should be implemented. And generally, a lot of them will come with customization and variables and methods. So the folder you see here is, and the image in the slide is very typical of what you might see professionally. You'll see a website with lower level CSS, images, and JS. So you might take those lower level folders and just simply move them to your root of your server. So one of the big libraries I want to show you today is the jQuery library called jQuery UI for user interface. And there will be a separate video on this, but this produces and provides themes, widgets, interactions, and effects, but they're very small. I don't know if you've ever seen an accordion, but that's a good example of what the jQuery UI would give you. And it has its own methods and properties. So I would advise you, if you want to see it right away before we end this lecture, just turn off this presentation and go over to the jQuery UI tour. And you can see what I'm talking about. The core jQuery UI component is always required in addition to the jQuery code for these components. So what you're going to see in your code is the source tag to go to the jQuery library, and then underneath that you'll see the jQuery UI source tag. And then you'll be able to access all the things that jQuery UI allows us to do. So it's a very dependent type environment we're talking about, but what it can do, it can really add to your functionality. So this is jQueryUI.com and what it looks like. Of course, there will be that video tutorial. And again, with each one of these things, you see on the left of that image, draggable, droppable, resizable, and under widgets, you see first is accordion, and then it's followed by autocomplete. So basically, to get accustomed to this, you just need to go to the website and look at the interactions and widgets and see what's available and see how it might help your website or your web development without being distracting. jQuery UI for me is very useful in the right situations, but you don't want to add interactivity that would be distracting to the user. In week 15, which is next week, we'll be covering jQuery Mobile, which is just another jQuery library that depends on jQuery, and it's for mobile devices. Okay, so the types of components we can find with jQuery UI are themes, basically CSS themes for components, things like buttons and text areas. It also has widgets, and widgets come in the form of accordions, date pickers, sliders, and tabs. The widgets themselves will be self-contained, and what that means is they'll have their own properties inside the code. So this will be extremely easy because you can just copy and paste the code to implement these widgets. It also has interactions like drag, drop, resize, or even sort. You can sort table elements, for example. Think of a table of data, and if you want to sort by alphabet, you can implement the jQuery UI sort functionality. So it also has effects where we can animate, have a transition, have a bounce, explode, fade, slide, all sorts of movements that can be used with any interaction. Again, we want to know that this is available and be able to use it. However, we also want to be sure that we're not distracting. I've worked in a few firms where jQuery UI was distracting, but everybody loved it because it seemed different to the people in my companies. And that's a problem. That means they're doing it just to be different without doing customer or user testing. That's one thing that's huge. If we simply use a few user tests, maybe 5 people or less, we can get a good idea of whether they think that the jQuery UI implementations are distracting or not. So how do we use this? Well, we'll go to the downloads and we'll download it like a plugin. And what we'll do is basically build our download. And again, this is something that I'm going to go over in a separate video. But I encourage you to try it. Go to jQueryui.com download, and you can basically build how you want the jQuery UI to appear. Now, as you know, throughout this course, I've been encouraging you not to use content delivery networks because it makes your work dependent on an internet connection. However, this is another case where by doing a customized jQuery UI download and having the code in the same directory or in the same folder system of this website that we're working on, you wouldn't have to rely on that jQuery UI, and you can create a jQuery UI that's minimized. It's to the smallest element because you've only built the elements that you need for what you need it for. So this is a great thing, and it further enforces my contention that CDNs should be used in limited amounts, if at all. This is a good example of the jQuery UI download example. After the download builder, you should see the jQuery UI CSS, a jQuery UI JS, and those are traditional code. They're expanded or beautified. That's another word that is the opposite of minified. And then you see its minified versions. So here you get a good idea. If you look at the jQuery UI JS, you'll see it's 509 kilobytes. By using the minified file, you'll reduce it by 261 kilobytes, which is quite a bit. So what you can do is work as a developer in the jQuery UI JS if you have the chops to deal with what you built, and once you're ready, you can minify it when you go into production. Now, this is something we haven't touched on in this course. Minification of JavaScript code can certainly reduce a lot of the download time for your user. So here is a jQuery UI code sample. And in this case, we're calling, you see the jQuery version of UI with min CSS. And then we're calling jQuery itself. In this case, we're actually using the CDN. And then below it, we're calling our own jQuery UI min, which is customized and built through that download builder. So whatever the selector would be, we would have some sort of UI method. One UI method you'll learn is called Accordion. So what we could say is we could apply an accordion, and I'll show you examples of this. They're in the Chapter 11 folder. But basically that's how it works. You'd find your selector and do a dot and then have whatever method is, accordion, transition, something like that, and then you have your options inside there. So you're applying the method to that selector and then customizing it. Again, don't be fooled by the fact that this code example is CDN. Well, it's okay to have the jQuery library in CDN. When you go live, it's better to have it local. Okay, here's an accordion example. We've got the section right here, section 1 and section 2, and the accordions below it. So the document ready would be selector and accordion and then its settings. So here's a div ID accordion, dot accordion, and then we see divs with certain content. This example is in the Chapter 11 zip file, which is in our folder. So this right here refers to the jQuery theme ruler. And this theme ruler will allow you to create CSS for your jQuery UI effects that will match your current CSS for your themes. If you have a certain color scheme, or if you have a certain background or a certain concept, let's say it's flat UI with soft colors, you can work to make sure your effects match the theme of the website. And jQuery theme ruler, this is the last part of this presentation, is an extremely powerful theme engine. It'll have its separate video. So you can create a theme for your website, select anything you want, colors, fonts, drop shadows, And you can also have the opportunity to use 24 preset themes. Hopefully you find one that matches the site theme that you have on your own CSS. So now that we've done with this presentation, we're going to go into a couple of other presentations that go over jQuery UI, and then this theme roller, and then we'll go through the book code, and then later on in this week's content we'll present our jQuery JavaScript final project idea, and you'll have 2 weeks to do it. All right. Any questions, don't hesitate to email me.